Okay, the next unit of the class, the first unit discussed what philosophy is. The next unit looks at a particular topic in philosophy, epistemology, which is roughly the study of knowledge. I mentioned in class that episteme is a Greek root of know, and ology is for an account of, so like biology is an account of life. Life, for example, bios. Epistemology is an account of knowledge. And it's come to be used to denote not just accounts of knowledge, but accounts of related notions, like rational belief and justification and warrant and evidence. Any discussion that's broadly in the domain of knowledge or notions closely related to knowledge is discussed under the label epistemology. Okay, we're going to start off with a little puzzle, and I'm going to use this puzzle to illustrate the distinction between cognitive psychology and epistemology. You might think that really cognitive psychologists should be the ones studying knowledge and belief and how we come to know things, evidence, and so on and so forth. That is how we think of evidence and so on and so forth. But that's not right. And I mean, not that cognitive psychologists can't study those things, but they're not studying them in the way that philosophers do. And there's a straightforward reason. It has to do with the distinction between description and prescription that we've already talked about. But we're going to sort of use a puzzle to illustrate this. So here's a rule. If a card has a vowel on one side, where the sides at issue are front and back, not to the left and to the right. So if a card has a vowel on, say, the front, then it has an even number on the back. Or if it has a vowel on the back, then it has an even number on the front. So if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. That's the rule. If it has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. And here's a few cards. This card has an A on the side that you can see, this card has a C, this card has a 4, and this card has a 3. So these are 4 distinct cards. You can see one side of each card, but not the other side. And here's your task. I want you to choose only those cards and all those cards that you need to turn over in order to decisively determine whether the rule above, that is this rule here, is true. That is, whether it holds for these cards. So again, the rule says if a vowel on one side, then an even number on the other side, and you have to turn over these cards in order to determine whether that rule describes them accurately, whether it's true of them. And you should pause the video here if you haven't done this task and go do this task. Figure out which cards you think you need to turn over. But I'm going to proceed. Okay. So here's an outline of all the different things that we're going to do. We're going to start off by talking about what epistemology is. And as I said, we're going to use that little puzzle that you just attempted in order to illustrate what epistemology is. So start off with the distinction between cognitive psychology and epistemology. Cognitive psychology studies, among other things, inter alia is just a Latinism for among other things. I'm only using it not because I like Latinisms, but because if I wrote among other things, it wouldn't fit on this line. So cognitive psychology studies, among other things, how we form beliefs. Epistemology studies, among other things, how we should form beliefs. And notice that's an important distinction. So, for example, there may be ways of forming beliefs that are typical of people that aren't good. A cognitive psychologist can identify, here's how you do in fact form beliefs. But it doesn't, in and of itself, pass judgment about whether those ways of forming beliefs are good or bad. If it does so, it moves out of the domain of psychology and into the domain of epistemology. Now, particular practicing cognitive psychologists may make presumptions about which forms of reasoning are good and which are bad, or they may even argue that this or that form of reasoning is good or that it's bad. But when they're doing so, their judgments are no longer based on the observations they're making of their subjects. Their judgments are based on something else. And that's where we're drawing the divide between cognitive psychology and epistemology, or philosophy more generally. When you shift out of the realm of the observable into the realm of the unobservable, you're doing philosophy, in this case, epistemology. Because, as I've mentioned a few times, you can't observe how things ought to be. You can only observe how they are. Cognitive psychology focuses on how they are, on description. Epistemology focuses on how reasoning should be, prescription. Okay, so here's a slide to illustrate this distinction, referring to the puzzle we talked about earlier. The psychologist comes in and performs an experiment, says to the subject, here are 4 cards. Each card has a letter on either the front or the back and a number on the opposite side. So again, when we say side here, we don't mean to the left of or to the right of, we mean the opposite side of this card. So on the opposite side of this card, there's a number or a letter. On the opposite side of this card, there's a number or a letter, and so on. we want you to choose only those cards that you must in order to determine whether the following rule holds. If it has a vowel on one side, so like this one has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side, on the opposite side of the card. If, say this is the front, then it has an even number on the back. Say this is the back, then it has an even number on the front. Okay, so if a vowel on one side, then an even number on the other side. And suppose this guy says A and 4. Those are the right cards to turn over. Turn over card A and turn over card 4. This, in fact, is the most common response, and a psychologist can report that and say, look, when I give people this problem, 80% of them say A and 4. Now, an epistemologist can come in and say, but that's wrong. Now, the cognitive psychologist, again, may know that that's wrong, but she doesn't know that that's wrong in virtue of observing how subjects respond. All she can see is how they respond, not which response is correct. If she knows it's wrong, she knows it's wrong because of reasoning. And that's what she's sort of shifting into being an epistemologist. And that's what epistemologists focus on, is what are the right ways of reasoning and what are the wrong ways. So the epistemologist says A and 4 is wrong. And now what I want you to see is why A and 4 is wrong, although this is primarily to illustrate the distinction between what cognitive psychologists do and what epistemologists do. The epistemologist is now going to go on to do her job and explain why A and 4 is wrong, or to show that it's wrong, to explain why. So the rule says this: if a vowel on one side, then an even number on the other. And now what she's going to do is walk you through each card. So she's going to say, look, let's imagine that on the opposite side of this card, we have a 2. Does that make the rule if vowel then even wrong? Well, it doesn't, right? Because you'd have vowel paired with even, so that's okay. But let's imagine instead that there's a 3 on the opposite side of the card. Would that make the rule if vowel then even wrong? Well, it would, because this says if you have a vowel on one side, you've got to have an even on the other, but then you have a vowel with an odd. So that would make the rule wrong. So in order to test the rule, you're going to need to turn over this card. You're going to need to turn over card A to see, is there an odd number on the other side? If there is, it's wrong. If there isn't, it's okay so far. What about C? Well, suppose there's a 2 on the opposite side of C. Would that make the rule if vowel then even wrong? You might be tempted to think it would, but it doesn't, because the rule does not say this. It does not say if it has an even on one side, it must have a vowel on the other side. It only says if it has a vowel on one side, it must have an even number on the other side. That's an important distinction between necessary and sufficient conditions. What the rule says is that having an even number on one side is a necessary condition for having a vowel on the other, and having a vowel on one side is a sufficient condition for having an even on the other. But the rule does not say that having a vowel on one side is a necessary condition for having an even on the other, and it does not say that having an even on one side is a sufficient condition for having a vowel on the other. To think that you would need to turn over card C to make sure it's not paired with an even number is to confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. It's to confuse the nature of this conditional, which only says if vowel and even, but does not say if even then vowel. Notice, to think that this says if even then vowel is just like to think that, if you're a sister, then you're a sibling, implies if you're a sibling, then you're a sister, which clearly it does not. Okay, so you don't need to turn over card C because pairing a C with a 2 is just fine, and pairing a C with a 3 is just fine, because the rule doesn't say you can't have consonants paired with even numbers, nor does it say you can't have consonants paired with odd numbers, so no need to turn over card C. Now what about card 4? Well, the same point applies to card 4. The rule says if vowel then even. Suppose you have a 4 paired with a vowel. Well, clearly that's okay. But suppose you have a 4 paired with a consonant. Is that okay too? Yes, it is, because the rule does not say if even, then vowel. It just says if vowel, then even. So having a B paired with a 4 is perfectly fine. This rule allows that you can have a consonant paired with an even. It just says you can't have a you can't have a vowel paired with an odd. Consonant paired with even is okay. Vowel paired with even is okay. What's not okay is vowel paired with odd. And there's no way you could have a vowel paired with an odd on the opposite side of the 4, because 4 is even. So you don't need to turn over card 4. What about card 3? Well, if you have an A on the opposite side, then you have a pairing of vowel with odd. The rule says if vowel then even. You can't have vowel paired with odd. So you do need to turn over card 3 to make sure it's not paired with a vowel. So In order to determine whether this rule holds, you need to turn over cards A and 3, but 80% of subjects say cards A and 4, so most people get it wrong. If the cognitive psychologist were to attempt to infer that the correct answer is the answer that's most common, the cognitive psychologist would fail. That is, she would fail to identify what the correct answer in fact is. And of course, cognitive psychologists don't do that. They aren't in the business of trying to figure out what the correct forms of inference are. They're in the business of seeing how people in fact infer, how people in fact reason. It's epistemologists who try and identify what the correct forms of inference are and explain why those are the correct ones. Okay, so the correct answer is A and 3. Again, the cognitive psychologist aims to describe how we form beliefs to the extent that can be done experimentally. The epistemologist aims to prescribe how we should form beliefs. That cannot be done experimentally. So these are just two very different enterprises, and I want you to be clear about which of these is the epistemological enterprise. It's the attempt to prescribe. It's the attempt to say, here's how good reasoning works. Okay. We're going to stop this video there. In the next video, we'll talk about the notions of belief, justification, truth, and knowledge. We've talked about these a little bit before, but we'll reiterate and expand on what was said before.